and we owe her the most heartfelt debt any family could owe to their mother, for her love, affection, guidance, understanding, and example. Queen Elizabeth was a life well lived, a promise with destiny kept, and she is mourned most deeply in her passing. That promise of lifelong service I renew.
King Charles stuns the entire UK after breaking his silence about Diana, leaving everyone speechless. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because the words now being attached to King Charles and Diana are not about another old royal photograph or another familiar argument from the past. They concern an alleged private palace meeting, a review of old correspondence, and a claim that Charles finally confronted a subject the royal family had spent decades avoiding. According to the story surrounding that meeting, Charles allegedly acknowledged that Diana had been deliberately isolated after challenging senior courtiers, and that admission opened a far more disturbing question. The person at the center of that question was Diana herself, and the material reportedly connected to her was said to be more personal than any public interview, speech, or biography. An alleged confidential letter, written shortly before her death, had supposedly been preserved in royal records. Yet the most important part of that letter was said to be missing. Its final page allegedly named the person Diana believed was secretly working against her. That makes this story different. It is about what Diana may have believed when she was still alive. Now, watch this. The alleged revelation did not emerge from a public ceremony or a prepared television address.
So, yes, I did inflict upon myself. I didn't like myself. I was ashamed that I couldn't cope with the pressures.
What did you actually do?
Well, I just hurt my arms and my legs. And I work in environments now where I see women doing similar things, and I'm able to understand completely where they're coming from.
It was reportedly connected to a private palace discussion that unexpectedly became public. That matters because private conversations inside royal circles carry a different weight from carefully prepared statements. A public speech can be edited, reviewed, and approved. A private meeting can expose the words people never expected the public to hear. Hi viewers, if you had one chance to know what Diana was really trying to say before she died, would you want to know the truth? Leave yes or no below in the comments, because this story turns on a question that has refused to disappear. And there was another name caught in the tension surrounding the alleged disclosure: William. According to the account behind this story, he opposed reopening painful questions about his mother, fearing that another public examination of Diana's final years could reopen wounds that had never healed. That reported resistance immediately changed the meaning of the meeting. This was no longer only about Charles deciding to speak. It was about a son facing the past again. The atmosphere surrounding the alleged meeting was therefore unusually charged. Charles was not simply discussing Diana as a historical figure. The account suggests that old palace correspondence had been reviewed before the statement emerged. If those documents existed in the form described, they could offer a glimpse into what happened behind the polished public image of the monarchy. But one phrase reportedly changed everything. Diana had been deliberately isolated. Those words carry enormous weight because isolation does not necessarily mean being physically alone. A person can be surrounded by advisors, family members, officials, and reporters, yet still feel cut off from those controlling decisions affecting her life. In Diana's case, the allegation suggests something more deliberate. It suggests that challenging senior courtiers may have carried a price, and that the price was distance, exclusion, and the quiet removal of influence. That claim belongs to the allegations and reported accounts surrounding this story. Its importance comes from what it would mean if the account were accurate. Diana would not merely have been struggling against the pressures of royal life. She would have believed that some of the people around her were actively limiting her ability to be heard. And that is where the story takes its first sharp turn. Because if Charles had really come to acknowledge that Diana was isolated after challenging powerful figures, then the next question becomes almost unavoidable. What had she been trying to tell them? The answer, according to the story, was contained in a letter. Not a speech, Not a newspaper interview, not a statement prepared by advisors, a private letter. The alleged correspondence was said to have been written by Diana shortly before her death and intended for Charles.
In 1947, on her 21st birthday, she pledged in a broadcast from Cape Town to the Commonwealth to devote her life, whether it be short or long, to the service of her peoples. That was more than a promise. It was a profound personal commitment which defined her whole life. She made
The very idea of such a letter changes the emotional temperature of the story. Diana was famous for speaking publicly, but a confidential letter would represent something far more intimate, words chosen for one person, away from cameras and crowds. The timing makes the alleged letter unsettling. It was supposedly written near the end of Diana's life, when her relationship with the royal establishment had already become one of the most scrutinized subjects in Britain. By then, almost every public appearance could become a headline. Every friendship could become a story. Every movement could be photographed. Every disagreement could be interpreted as another battle between Diana and the institution. Yet the alleged letter would have existed outside that public theater. If it was genuine, and if its contents were accurately described, Diana was no longer speaking to the world. She was speaking privately, directly, and with the expectation that the person receiving the letter would understand what she meant. That matters, because the story does not claim that Diana simply complained about palace life. It points towards something more specific. She allegedly believed that someone was working against her, and then comes the detail that turns a private letter into a royal mystery. The final page was allegedly missing. At first glance, a missing page might sound like an administrative problem. Old archives can be incomplete. Documents can be separated, damaged, misplaced, transferred, or cataloged incorrectly. But when the missing section is allegedly the final page of a confidential letter written shortly before Diana's death, the absence itself becomes part of the story. What was written there? Who was the letter really accusing? And if the page disappeared from the archive, who knew it had existed? Those questions create a gap that the surviving material cannot completely fill. The alleged first pages could explain Diana's fear. They could reveal her frustration. They could describe her sense of isolation. But the missing final page, according to the account, was where the story became personal. It allegedly contained a name. That single possibility is enough to change the way everything before it is viewed. The reported isolation, the challenges to senior courtiers, the private correspondence, William's alleged concern about reopening the past, Charles's reported decision to speak after decades of silence. Each detail begins pointing toward the same unresolved question. What did Diana know, and who did she believe she could no longer trust? But the most uncomfortable part may not be the missing page itself. It may be the possibility that Charles had to confront the existence of that page before he could make his alleged admission, because if the correspondence had been reviewed, then someone had to look at the records. Someone had to decide what was relevant. Someone had to recognize that Diana's words still carried enormous emotional and political weight decades after her death, and that is why this alleged palace revelation matters now. It brings the past into a room where the past was never supposed to speak again. For decades, Diana's story has been retold through photographs, documentaries, interviews, books, royal statements, and memories from people who knew her. Yet the closer the story moves toward private correspondence, the less certain the ground becomes. Public history is built from what can be seen. Private history is often built from what was written, remembered, withheld, or lost. The alleged letter sits at that boundary. And if the final page really did identify the person Diana feared, then the silence surrounding it becomes almost as important as the words themselves. The next question is therefore not simply whether Charles finally spoke. It is why he would choose to speak now, why William would reportedly want the subject left alone, and why a missing page from a letter could still have the power to shake the royal family decades later. Because once the story moves inside Diana's final correspondence, the palace walls stop looking like the end of the mystery.
When I started my public life 12 years ago, I understood the media might be interested in what I did, but I was not aware of how overwhelming that attention would become.
They become the place where the mystery begins. And if this story matters enough to you to hear what was allegedly written before that final page disappeared, then do not look away now, because the next part goes directly into the letter, the circumstances surrounding it, and the detail that makes its missing final page so much more disturbing. Stay with the story, because that is where everything gets worse. The letter was not the only thing that made the alleged disclosure dangerous. The deeper problem was what surrounded it. For years, Diana had lived inside a system where almost nothing stayed private for long. Meetings were recorded in schedules. Conversations passed through advisors. Decisions moved through layers of officials before reaching the people they affected. That structure could protect the institution, but it could also leave someone at the center feeling that every move was being watched. The allegation now attached to Charles is more specific. Diana was not simply frustrated with palace life. She allegedly believed that challenging senior courtiers had caused her to be deliberately pushed further away from the people and decisions that mattered. That distinction changes the story. A difficult marriage is one thing. A difficult institution is another. But the suggestion that Diana believed she was being isolated because she had challenged powerful figures creates a much more serious question about who controlled access to her, who influenced the information reaching her, and who decided which concerns deserved attention. There is no need to invent a dramatic confrontation to understand why such a claim would matter. In a royal household, influence rarely depends on one person shouting across a room. It can operate through invitations, schedules, briefings, introductions, access, and private advice. A person can be excluded without anyone announcing that they have been excluded. That is why the alleged correspondence becomes so important. If Diana really wrote privately to Charles about what she was experiencing, the letter could have preserved her own account at a moment when public versions of events were already competing for attention. A letter has a different character from a newspaper report. It records what the writer chose to put into words for a particular recipient, and that recipient mattered. Charles was not an outside observer. He was directly connected to Diana's royal life and to the institutions surrounding her. Any confidential message sent to him would therefore carry a difficult question with it. Was Diana asking to be heard, asking for protection, warning him about someone, or trying to make him understand something she felt could not safely be said in public? The alleged archive does not answer all of those questions. That is precisely what makes the surviving material so intriguing. According to the story, the correspondence was reviewed after the private meeting became public. The review reportedly drew attention to Diana's concerns and to the alleged missing final page. But a missing page cannot speak for itself. It cannot establish why it disappeared, who removed it, or whether its absence was deliberate. Those distinctions matter. The mystery grows because the alleged document is being asked to carry more meaning than a surviving page can safely provide. One part of the story is the claim that Diana wrote the letter. Another is the claim that the final page was removed. A third is the claim that the missing section identified a person Diana believed was secretly working against her. Those are separate claims. Put together, they create a powerful narrative, but each one still needs to be treated carefully. That caution does not make the story less compelling, it makes the unanswered questions sharper. Because even without the alleged name, the central issue remains. Why would Diana have felt the need to write privately at all? The answer may lie in the pressure surrounding her final period of public life. Diana's popularity had become extraordinary. Her appearances could draw enormous attention, and her relationship with the public often seemed to operate on a different level from the formal authority of the monarchy. That popularity gave her influence, but it also intensified scrutiny. The more visible she became, the harder privacy became. The more independent she appeared, the more closely her choices were examined. And the more she challenged expectations, the more every disagreement could become evidence of a deeper conflict. This is where the alleged isolation becomes central. If Diana believed that senior courtiers were working to limit her influence, then ordinary palace disagreements could have looked very different from her perspective. A delayed meeting could feel deliberate. A change in access could feel like punishment. A decision made without her could feel like proof that her voice no longer mattered. Whether every one of those interpretations was justified is impossible to establish from the allegations alone. But the psychological effect of feeling excluded can be real, even when the motives behind individual actions remain uncertain. That is the part often lost when Diana's story is reduced to headlines. The public saw the photographs, the public saw the arguments, the public saw the interviews, the public saw the extraordinary attention surrounding her. What the public could not see was the private calculation behind every conversation. Who was she speaking to? Who was advising her? Who did she trust, and who did she fear? The alleged letter brings those questions into a single place. It also creates a difficult problem for Charles. If the reported correspondence was genuine, then reading it decades later would not simply mean revisiting Diana's memories. It would mean confronting words written by a woman whose death transformed the monarchy and Britain itself. That is why the reported decision to review the correspondence becomes more significant than the document alone. Someone had to decide that the old records were worth examining. Someone had to confront whatever they contained, and if the final page was truly absent, someone would eventually have to explain why. The pressure surrounding Charles would therefore come from two directions. From one side, there would be the desire to preserve the dignity and stability of the institution. From the other, there would be the unresolved human question of what Diana believed was happening to her. Those interests do not always point in the same direction. That tension is crucial to understanding why William's reported opposition matters. If reopening Diana's final years risks exposing old wounds, then silence can look like protection. But silence can also look like avoidance. The difference depends on what someone already knows, and that is where the alleged letter creates its most uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps the most important information was never in the surviving pages at all. Perhaps it was on the page that could no longer be examined. That would explain why the missing section has become the focus of the story. Without it, the audience can hear Diana's alleged concerns but cannot see the conclusion she supposedly reached. The narrative stops just before the answer. That is not proof of a conspiracy. It is an absence. But an absence surrounding a confidential letter can generate questions that survive for decades. The alleged name, if it existed, would not automatically prove that Diana's suspicion was correct. It would only reveal what she allegedly believed at the time. That distinction is vital. A person's fear can be sincere without every conclusion behind that fear being accurate. Still, if Charles truly confronted such a document, the emotional burden would be enormous. He would not merely be reading an old letter, he would be reading Diana's voice after decades of silence. And the question would become impossible to avoid. Why was she writing this to him instead of saying it publicly? The answer could reveal more about the relationship between Diana and the palace than any headline ever managed to do. There is another reason the alleged letter matters. Diana was not writing into an empty room. She was writing at a time when her private life was already being examined by people outside the family, while decisions affecting her position could be shaped by people she did not control. That creates a dangerous imbalance. The person being discussed may know that something is wrong, yet still lack the authority to change it. She can object, explain herself, or ask for help, but the machinery around her can continue moving. If that was how Diana understood her situation, the letter may have been an attempt to break through that machinery. And if Charles received it, then he became a witness to a private warning that could not easily be dismissed as another newspaper story. The question is whether he acted on what he allegedly read, because if he did act, the archive should show traces of that decision. If he did not, the silence becomes another unanswered question. Either way, the alleged letter points toward a decision that someone made behind closed. And if that decision was connected to Diana's final warning, then the next part is where this story becomes far more difficult to dismiss. Stay, because the alleged contents of that letter lead directly toward the missing page and the name it was supposedly never meant for the public to see. The missing page was not the beginning of the mystery, it was the point where the story allegedly stopped. That distinction matters because a letter can survive without its final page and still reveal a great deal. The surviving words can establish the writer's mood, concerns, and intentions. But the final page is where a private message often reaches its conclusion. If the account surrounding Diana's letter is accurate, that conclusion is exactly what disappeared. According to the story, the letter was confidential and was written to Charles shortly before Diana's death. The precise date and wording of the alleged document have not been independently established here, so the most important claims must remain claims. Yet the allegation itself is striking because it places Diana in direct communication with Charles at a time when tensions surrounding her royal life were already intense. The alleged letter reportedly did more than describe unhappiness. It pointed toward fear. That is where the tone changes. A complaint can be dismissed as frustration. A warning is harder to dismiss. If Diana believed someone was deliberately working against her, she would have been identifying what she considered a threat, not merely expressing disappointment. And according to the account, the person she feared was not identified in the surviving portion that has been described publicly. The missing final page supposedly contained that name. Now consider what that means. If the page was removed intentionally, the identity of the person would have vanished with it. If it was lost accidentally, the same result would remain. The difference is enormous, but the consequence is identical. The audience is left with Diana's alleged concern and without the final piece needed to understand it. That gap is exactly where speculation begins. Some readers might see an innocent archival problem. Others might see evidence that something was deliberately withheld. Neither interpretation can be established simply because a page is missing. But the question becomes more serious when the alleged document is connected to a private palace discussion and a reported review of archive correspondence. The story now has three separate pieces: a confidential letter, a missing final page, and a name that was allegedly written on it. Put those pieces together, and the mystery becomes much larger than Diana's relationship with Charles. It becomes a question about trust. Who did Diana trust enough to write to? Who did she believe she could not trust? And why would she put that fear into writing? Those questions matter because written words can become evidence of a person's state of mind. They can show what someone believed before later events changed the public understanding of them. They can also expose fears that never reached a camera or a newspaper. For Diana, privacy had become increasingly difficult to maintain. Her public life was constantly examined. Her relationships attracted attention. Her decisions became subjects of speculation. Even ordinary movements could be turned into stories. A private letter would have offered a different kind of space. No crowd, no microphone, no waiting reporter. Only the person writing, and the person expected to read it. That makes the alleged choice of Charles as the recipient especially important. If Diana wanted publicity, there were countless ways to create it. She had already demonstrated that she could command enormous public attention. A confidential letter suggests the opposite intention. She allegedly wanted a private response from someone who understood the institution from inside. But what did she want from Charles? An explanation? Protection? Recognition? Or simply for him to understand what she believed was happening? The account does not establish the answer. That uncertainty should remain visible, because the strongest part of this mystery is not pretending to know what cannot be proven. It is following the unanswered questions to the point where they become impossible to ignore. One of those questions concerns the alleged phrase that Diana had been deliberately isolated. If the letter supported that belief, then the document would connect a private fear with the wider allegation about senior courtiers. It would also give the reported palace discussion a more troubling context. Charles would not merely be confronting a decades-old family disagreement. He would be confronting an alleged record of Diana describing how she felt treated while she was still alive. That could explain why reopening the material would be emotionally dangerous for William. William would not be looking at an abstract historical dispute. He would be looking at his mother's private words and at the possibility that those words contained an accusation she never had the chance to explain publicly. That is a very different burden, and it creates another question. If the letter was so sensitive, why was it preserved at all? Royal archives are built to preserve records. Correspondence can survive for decades because institutions understand that private papers may later become part of the historical record. Yet preservation creates another problem. Once a document survives, its existence can become more revealing than its contents. The existence of the alleged letter would establish that Diana chose to put something into writing. The missing page would suggest that the record is incomplete. The alleged name would provide the motive for why people might care about that missing section. But none of those points automatically proves wrongdoing. That distinction is essential. A missing document is not proof of a cover-up. A private suspicion is not proof that the suspected person was guilty. And a later recollection is not automatically proof of what happened decades earlier. Still, the questions remain. And the questions become sharper when the alleged letter is placed beside the reported decision by Charles to break his silence. Why now? Why discuss Diana after so many years? Why revisit archived correspondence? Why risk reopening a subject that has caused pain within the family? And why would the name on a missing page matter enough to become part of the story? There is a possible answer hidden inside the timing. The alleged disclosure reportedly came after old correspondence was reviewed. That sequence matters. It suggests that the statement was not simply a spontaneous emotional reaction. According to the account, the records were considered before the issue became public. If true, that would mean the past was not merely being remembered, it was being examined. An examination creates a different kind of pressure. Memory can change, documents remain. That is why archives can be so powerful. They can challenge stories that have been repeated for years. They can confirm some details, complicate others, and sometimes reveal that people remembered the same event very differently. The alleged Diana letter sits at the center of that tension. If its surviving content was genuine, it could preserve her own voice. If the final page was genuinely missing, it could also preserve a silence. And silence can become dangerous when everyone wants to know what was left unsaid. This is where the story reaches its most sensitive point. The alleged name cannot be treated as established fact simply because the story says it existed. The identity has not been independently demonstrated by the material available here, but the claim that Diana believes someone was working against her is precisely what drives the mystery forward. Because if she truly believed that, then someone occupied a very specific place in her private fears. And if Charles later encountered that warning, he would have been forced to confront a question that could not be answered by ceremony, protocol, or public statements. Did anyone listen to Diana when she was alive? That question is far more uncomfortable than the missing page itself. It shifts attention away from the document and back toward the people surrounding her, the people who advised her, the people who influenced decisions, the people who knew what she was saying, and the people who may have understood how isolated she felt. There is a detail that cannot be ignored. A confidential letter does not become significant merely because it mentions a family. Its significance comes from the possibility that Diana was attempting to create a record while she still had the opportunity. If she feared being misunderstood, writing could have been her way of fixing her version of events. That possibility gives the alleged correspondence its emotional force. Diana's public image was interpreted by others. A letter, if genuine, would have allowed her to speak without someone else deciding what she meant. If its final page disappeared, then the words that might have explained her fear would be the words no one can examine. By this point, the alleged letter has stopped being an old piece of correspondence. It has become a doorway into a much larger dispute over who had influence around Diana, who had access to her, and who may have benefited from keeping certain tensions away from public view. That is why the final page matters, not because a missing sheet of paper automatically proves a secret. It matters because the page allegedly contained the one thing that could turn Diana's private fear into a specific accusation: a name. And once a name enters a story like this, the consequences change completely. The next part has to confront the question everyone will be asking. Who was Diana allegedly referring to, and why would that person have been at the center of her fears? If that question matters to you, do not let silence win again. Like, share, and subscribe, then stay for the next part, because the story is about to move from what Diana allegedly feared to the person she may have believed was behind it. The name was the detail that could change everything. Until this point, the alleged letter has been a mystery built around absence. A page was supposedly missing. A warning was allegedly left incomplete. Diana's private concerns could be discussed, but the person at the center of those concerns could not be identified with certainty. Now the story reaches its most sensitive point. The account behind the palace disclosure claims that the missing final page named the person Diana believed was secretly working against her. That allegation has not been independently established, and the available source material does not provide the page itself. But the claim matters because it transforms a general story about palace pressure into a specific allegation of distrust, and that changes how Charles's reported admission is understood. If Diana believed a particular person was working against her, then her alleged isolation was no longer simply about a strained relationship with an institution. In her mind, according to the story, there may have been an individual she considered dangerous to her position, her voice, or her ability to influence what happened around her. The identity is where the story becomes especially sensitive. There is a temptation in stories like this to rush toward a name and treat an allegation as a verdict. That would erase the distinction between what Diana may have believed and what can actually be proven. A private suspicion, even if genuinely recorded, would reveal her state of mind. It would not automatically establish that the person she suspected had actually acted against her. That distinction does not weaken the mystery. It makes the question more serious. Why would Diana have reached that conclusion? What had happened before the alleged letter was written? And what did Charles supposedly understand when he encountered those words? Those questions point back to the structure surrounding Diana during her final years. Her life inside the monarchy involved people with different responsibilities, loyalties, and interests. Some dealt with official duties. Others managed schedules, communications, public appearances, and access. The system was complicated enough that disagreements could develop without becoming public confrontations. For someone as visible as Diana, that complexity created another problem. Every decision around her could have consequences. A change in a schedule could affect where she appeared. A change in advice could influence what she said. A decision about access could determine who she met. A briefing could shape how the press understood her actions. None of those things proves deliberate opposition. But if Diana already believed she was being isolated, ordinary institutional decisions could have carried a much heavier meaning. That is why the alleged final page becomes so important. It supposedly did not merely describe a problem, it allegedly attached the problem to a person, and that would explain why the document, if it existed in the form described, could become so uncomfortable decades later. The royal family has survived countless controversies because time can soften public arguments. People move on, institutions change, new generations take responsibility, old disputes become history. A private accusation inside an archive is different. It can remain frozen. The person who wrote it can no longer clarify it. The person named can no longer respond within the original context. The people who receive the document can remember events differently, and the public is left trying to reconstruct a conversation that happened long before most of the audience ever knew it existed. That is the trap surrounding this story. The alleged name could be explosive, yet the missing evidence prevents a clean conclusion. The reported palace meeting therefore becomes important for another reason. If Charles really decided to speak after reviewing correspondence, then he was not simply revisiting Diana's public legacy. He was reportedly confronting material connected to her private fears. That would help explain the sensitivity attributed to William. William's reported objection would not necessarily mean he wanted Diana's story buried. It could mean he understood exactly what reopening it could do to the family. Every new claim about his mother's final years would invite another round of scrutiny. Every allegation would be examined through the lens of her death. Every old disagreement could be reopened and placed beside the decisions of people who were still alive. For a son, that could be unbearable. For a future king, it could also become an institutional problem. Those two pressures can exist at the same time. The human desire to protect a mother does not always match the institutional desire to protect a family name. That tension is what gives the reported disagreement between Charles and William its significance. But there is an even bigger issue. If Charles allegedly knew that Diana had written a warning, why did decades pass before the subject became part of a public conversation? Was the material ignored? Was it considered too private? Was it disputed? Or was there simply no verified document capable of proving the claims now being attached to it? Those possibilities are very different. The story does not provide a definitive answer. What it provides is a chain of allegations that becomes increasingly difficult to separate from the emotions surrounding Diana's legacy. That is precisely why responsible narration matters here. The allegation that a particular person was named cannot be presented as established fact. The missing page cannot be treated as proof of deliberate removal, and Charles's reported statement cannot automatically be treated as confirmation of every claim surrounding the letter. But the questions remain, and sometimes the unanswered question is the part that keeps a story alive. Consider what the alleged letter would mean if the account were accurate. Diana, already under enormous public pressure, privately writes to Charles. She describes concerns that she allegedly cannot resolve publicly. She identifies the possibility that someone is working against her. Then the record of that correspondence becomes incomplete. Years later, Charles allegedly reviews the material and speaks about Diana's isolation. William reportedly objects to reopening the subject. Suddenly, the missing page is no longer an isolated archival detail. It becomes the missing link between Diana's private fear and the royal family's later understanding of it. That is why the alleged disclosure has attracted so much attention. It suggests that the most important part of the story may never have been the public Diana at all. It may have been the private Diana who wrote down what she feared when no camera was watching. And if Charles really broke his silence because those old records forced him to confront something he had spent decades avoiding, then his statement would carry a meaning far beyond one family disagreement. It would represent an admission that the past still had unfinished business. The question then becomes what happened after the alleged letter was written. Did anyone respond to Diana? Did Charles confront the concerns she reportedly raised? Did the palace change its approach? Did anyone investigate the person she allegedly suspected? Or did the warning disappear into the same system from which Diana reportedly felt isolated? There is no reliable evidence in the supplied material that answers those questions conclusively, but the absence of an answer creates the final pressure point. Because if Diana was asking to be heard, then someone had to make a decision about whether her fears deserved action. That decision, more than the missing page itself, could determine how this entire story should be understood. The alleged name is only one part of the mystery. The real question is whether anyone listened. And that question leads directly back to Charles. Why would he speak now? Why would he risk reopening the most painful chapter of his family's history? And what did he allegedly see in those records that made silence harder to maintain? And once that decision is placed beside Diana's alleged warning, the silence surrounding the royal archive begins to look less like an ending and more like the beginning of a confrontation nobody expected to see. The next part reaches that decision, and it is where the story turns from Diana's alleged warning to the consequences for Charles, William, and the royal family itself. If this story deserves to be heard rather than quietly forgotten, support it now with a like, a share, and a subscription, because staying silent is exactly what leaves uncomfortable questions buried. And the next part goes straight into why Charles allegedly decided he could no longer remain silent. The silence had lasted for decades. But according to the story surrounding this alleged palace disclosure, Charles finally reached a point where silence was no longer possible. That is the detail that brings the entire story back to its beginning. A private meeting, a discussion about Diana, a review of old correspondence, and a reported admission that Diana had been deliberately isolated after challenging senior courtiers. If that account is accurate, Charles was not simply revisiting an old family dispute. He was acknowledging a version of Diana's final years that carries a much heavier implication. It suggests that her struggle with the royal establishment may have involved more than personal disagreements. It may have involved a growing belief that people around her were limiting her influence and keeping her away from decisions that affected her own life. But the most difficult part remains the alleged letter. The letter matters because it gives the story a personal voice. It is one thing for historians, commentators, former officials, or royal observers to describe Diana's fears years later. It is another thing entirely for Diana herself to have allegedly written them down shortly before her death. Yet the crucial evidence remains incomplete. The final page has allegedly disappeared. That means the most explosive claim in this story cannot simply be treated as established fact. The alleged name cannot be verified from the material described here. The reason the page is missing cannot be established either. And the existence, wording, and full contents of the alleged correspondence would require evidence beyond the claims surrounding this account. Still, the allegation has power because it raises a question that has survived every attempt to close Diana's story. Was she trying to warn someone? If she was, then Charles may have been the person she chose to hear it. That possibility changes the meaning of his reported silence. Silence can mean many things. It can mean grief. It can mean uncertainty. It can mean protecting a family member. It can mean refusing to reopen a painful subject. Or it can mean that someone does not believe there is enough evidence to speak. The reported palace meeting therefore becomes significant, not because it proves every allegation, but because it allegedly placed Charles in front of material connected directly to Diana's private concerns. And William's reported opposition adds another layer. For William, Diana is not simply a chapter in royal history, she is his mother. Any discussion of her final years carries personal consequences that no archive can measure. Reopening those questions could invite renewed scrutiny of decisions made before he was old enough to control them. That does not prove that William opposed the truth. It could mean that he opposed reopening wounds. Those are not the same thing. And that distinction matters because this story is ultimately about more than Charles speaking. It is about what happens when a family tries to live with a past that the public refuses to leave behind. Diana's death ended her ability to explain herself. That is why every alleged letter, every archived document, and every recollection carries unusual weight. None can bring her back to clarify what she meant. None can answer a question she was never given the opportunity to answer herself. The alleged missing page makes that silence even more difficult. If it was lost, then history has an incomplete record. If it was removed deliberately, then the circumstances surrounding its removal would demand an explanation. If it never existed in the form claimed, then the entire allegation changes. Those possibilities cannot be collapsed into one conclusion, but they can be examined. And that is what makes the reported statement from Charles so important to the story. His alleged admission does not automatically prove the existence of a conspiracy, nor does it establish that Diana's suspicions were correct. What it does, within this account, is reopen a question that had been pushed into the past. What did Diana believe was happening to her? Who did she trust? Who did she fear? And why did those fears allegedly find their way into a private letter? The person Diana supposedly named may never be confirmed through the evidence described in this story. The alleged name is only one part of the mystery. The real question is whether anyone listened. That question leads directly back to Charles. Why would he speak now? Why would he risk reopening the most painful chapter of his family's history? And what did he allegedly see in those records that made silence harder to maintain? And once that decision is placed beside Diana's alleged warning, the silence surrounding the royal archive begins to look less like an ending and more like the beginning of a confrontation nobody expected to see. He could have left the past untouched. Instead, according to the story, he allegedly reopened it. For now, the responsible conclusion remains deeply uncomfortable. Diana's alleged fears remain allegations. The missing page remains unexplained. The identity supposedly written on it remains unverified. And Charles's reported admission must be judged against evidence, not emotion. But the questions deserve to be asked. Because a story involving Diana, Charles, William, a confidential letter, and an alleged missing page was never going to disappear simply because decades passed. So if you believe uncomfortable royal stories should be examined instead of buried, do not let this one disappear quietly. Like this video, share it with someone who remembers Diana's story. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because refusing to look away is the only way these unanswered questions remain visible. And the next video coming to this channel goes even deeper into the royal mysteries that were never meant to become public.